kind of what Opsgility does. And I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Becky Bertram, and we'll get started.
All right. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here today. I just want to apologize real quick because my three kids just had strep throat this last week, and I seem to have come down with something last week, so you get a very deep, husky voice. But here I am today to talk about an introduction to information architecture. As Ashley said, I am the owner of Savvy Technical Solutions, which is a consulting company based in the greater St. Louis area. We build custom solutions based on the Microsoft stack of products, specifically Office 365, SharePoint, and Azure. I've been awarded the SharePoint Server MVP for 8 years in a row, and I've helped author a number of the SharePoint Microsoft exams. I've co-authored Rock's book, and I actually have 3 kids, a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old, as you can see from the picture. So my hands are very busy, and so I try and do as much SharePoint stuff as I can in between doing things like running kids to pediatrician appointments for strep throat. At any rate, I'm glad that you can join me today. The topics we're going to be covering today are really, this is sort of SharePoint 101 type of material. Now, based on the poll, it looked like some of you are already familiar with a number of these concepts. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about the basic concepts, but it is important to go over just kind of what is in SharePoint in terms of, I want everybody to know what a site is, what a library is, how content types are used, because these are used to determine how we're going to structure the content in our sites. I also want to point out that Microsoft has been sort of morphing its view on how information is organized. So a lot of the concepts I'm going to be talking to you about are pretty basic in terms of how we've been doing things up until now. We're at sort of an interesting transition point with information architecture in Office 365, and I like to think that it's almost like Microsoft stood on one continent, had a whole plan for information architecture, and then they started over with another continent, but it's almost like they have to build a bridge backwards from the old way of doing things and the new way of doing things, in the sense that the new way of doing things seems to be a lot more unstructured and using a lot more artificial intelligence to be able to surface information based on how they work, and less based on sort of top-down kind of taxonomy. But what I'm going to be talking about today is really how you can organize information in your sites, built on more sort of the classic approach, which really isn't obsolete yet. It's really been tried and true for the last decade or so, but it is sort of morphing in terms of where Microsoft is moving in the future. So in this presentation, I'm going to start off talking about why we use SharePoint versus something like file share. I want to talk about concepts such as sites and site collections. I want to talk about lists and libraries. I want to talk about how content types are used. I want to talk about how we can set up security, and I want to talk about how search is used in all of this. Now, if you looked at all of these concepts, this is really the nuts and bolts of SharePoint. And since this is an Opsgility presentation, I want to point out that there's no way I can cover all of SharePoint in 1 hour. So this is, if you feel like we're flying through the information, we are. And if you want to learn more in depth about each of these concepts, we have an entire 10-part course that you can take that's the Introduction to SharePoint Online, where I go through in-depth demos with each of these concepts, and you have hands-on labs you can do if you want to learn more about these concepts. At the end of the presentation, I'm going to have time for questions. And since we only have a few people that have logged on live to this webinar, I'll be happy to open this up for questions at the end. And maybe we can have a little bit of back and forth. So with that, I'm going to start. I also want to point out that this presentation, I'm not sure what your audience is in terms of who you guys are. That's why I had the poll questions at the beginning. But I know a lot of times people sign up for Office 365 just because their organization has decided we need to use it for email, for Exchange, for OneDrive, for sharing. And then all of a sudden you get SharePoint, and it's like, I don't even really know what SharePoint does. And so I just wanted to point out one of the big reasons why people like using SharePoint, even though they may have signed up for Office 365 for the other services it offers, Skype, Exchange, Delve, OneDrive, those kind of things. SharePoint itself serves a number of purposes, but a big one is for document management. And something like having a versioning enabled in document management doesn't seem like a big deal until you think about the fact that on a file share, since there's no versioning, a lot of times you'll find documents such as proposal, proposal revised, proposal finished, proposal final 2.0, proposal final 2.0, I mean it. And so what you have is a bunch of these documents that are named different things that really don't have a qualified versioning system in place. With SharePoint, you can have versioning enabled, and in some cases you can have major and minor versioning, which really help determine what is the most recent version of a document, but it's easier to keep track of, and it's possible to roll back to previous versions. With SharePoint, you can do things like sharing. And sharing is something that really has only become sort of popular once products such as Dropbox and Box.com came into place. And that's the idea that it used to be if you had a file share, that file share lived on a drive within your network, and the only way you could get to it was to VPN in. Now, because Office 365 is on the internet, it's possible to share documents externally with other users in a very easy fashion. SharePoint is secure. That's a whole subject in and of itself, how it's locked down. But unlike a file share drive, a file share, it is possible to have security set up there as well. But the point is that SharePoint can be locked down, and we'll talk about that in a future slide in this deck. Another big benefit of SharePoint is that it's searchable. You can have Windows search a shared drive. But the SharePoint search engine is much more configurable. It can give you a lot more information about what you're searching for, such as the type of information being searched, properties about those files or the information being searched. You can determine what information is being searched. You can customize it. And with products such as Delve, the Office Graph, People page within Office 365, Microsoft can actually surface information to you based on a lot of criteria other than just a free text search based on the context of your the contents of your documents. So search is a lot more helpful, and this becomes increasingly helpful once the volume of data that's being stored increases. And finally, the benefits of using SharePoint are the fact that it's now available or possible to use Office Online products, which means you can now view an Excel document, a Word document, a PowerPoint document, all within the browser. It used to be that people, if they opened up some document, they had to have the client application installed on their computer. Now it's possible to view it online on any device. And by any device, it's not just Microsoft devices, but that can be an iPhone, an Android device, a tablet, anything like that. Along those lines, we now have the ability to synchronize documents from your hard drive up to a SharePoint library, which means if you still want to be able to work with documents locally or in a disconnected format, you can do that using SharePoint. So there are a number of different products on the market that might focus on some of these pieces of functionality, but the benefit of SharePoint is it's really the whole package, and it works seamlessly with Office 365. So when we talk about a site is really, this can be a confusing term only because sites can be, it's sort of a generic term, right, for any website. And SharePoint has a very specific term, and that's really a container for these lists and libraries. A site is going to have a unique URL. It can contain other sites, and it has its own configuration settings. So for instance, if we have a site for human resources, that would have a URL of /HR, and you can determine what that URL is. And it might contain a library that contains your web pages, such as your home page. It might have a library for site assets, and this might store things like images, documents that you want to display on that web page that a user navigates to. It can also have things like a document library called employee documents, another document library called training manuals, a calendar. And then you could have another site for your IT department, and it might be similar. It might also contain a page library for holding web pages and images and those sorts of things, but it can have different libraries and different lists that are stored inside of it. So each site is unique in and of itself. And when you get into this concept of a hierarchy, when you log into your tenant, you have a default team site that's been set up. And it's going to have a URL of your tenant name.sharepoint.com. That slash after it indicates the top level site. And inside here, you might have different sites that are sub-sites, as we call them, of that parent site. And then each sub-site could then, in turn, contain other sub-sites. So you can see how these URLs are fashioned and how each individual site can be its own container for separate lists and libraries, can have its own configuration settings, and in fact can have its own security settings as well. So in this example, you can see how perhaps for that HR department, maybe everybody can get to the HR department to be able to get to documents such as forms for travel requests or expense request forms or policies, manuals, but there may be a restricted subsite that only particular people have access to because maybe this contains employee information. So when you think about how you structure your site, you probably want to think about it in a logical fashion, and you think about the fact that you probably wouldn't, for obvious reasons, you wouldn't put your IT restricted site inside your HR subsite. So you really want to make sure that as you structure these sites, you're thinking about who is having access to it. And a lot of times that's a big determiner in terms of the content and the access rights for when you want to build a separate subsite within your site hierarchy. A site collection is simply one of these whole trees of sites. A site collection is self-contained. It's created by a SharePoint administrator, and it's managed by a site collection administrator as well. The reason I point that out is your site collection administrator can be different than the tenant administrator for Office 365. If you can have someone who's sort of like a super user, you can make them a site collection administrator. And that means they can grant things like user access, they can enable and deactivate or disable features, they can manage content within that site collection, but they're really administrator for that site collection only. Site collections don't share navigation with one another, they don't share security with one another, they really are silos of information. A site collection can have a quota that's set up on it, so if you want to make sure that one particular site collection is not chewing up all your storage for your tenant, you can actually set a quota on it, and users won't be able to add new content. It will become read-only once that quota is met. There are a number of configuration settings for a site collection that if you set it at the top level site, it's going to trickle down to the rest of the site. So for instance, if we look at that tree of sites we saw before, they are actually all part of the same site collection. The Internet Home site is considered the top level site. So there are some changes that if you make to that top level site, such as setting the master page, in many cases those settings will trickle down to every single subsite within that site collection. And there are other settings such as retention policies, search schemas. There are a number of things that can be set for that entire site collection that all the subsites within that site collection are going to have access to, configuration settings and the like. So when you're thinking about when you set up a site collection, you want to be able to think about things such as, do I want my navigation to all work together? Or do I want, for security reasons, to have different site collections? For instance, you can enable sharing or disable sharing for an entire site collection. So I've had some clients that have said, you know what, we want to have one site collection where we have disabled external sharing within the site collection. So for instance, if my main site collection is sort of an intranet site and I don't want users to have access outside my organization to content within my intranet, I can disable sharing for this site collection. However, I may set up a different site collection that's specifically for extranet capabilities, which means that site collection has been structured in such a way that we intentionally want people outside the site collection to have access to that site collection. In that way, if users do inadvertently get access to the wrong kind of information because somebody shared content incorrectly or something like that, it's mitigated the risk because that intranet site collection has not been set up for sharing. So when you think about how you structure your site collections, it's important many times to think about content, security, configuration settings, and those sorts of things. So very briefly, I'm just going to navigate to the site collection page in Office 365. So if I go to the SharePoint Administration Center, you can see all these site collections that have been set up for my tenant. Some of them came out of the box. This community site, this hub site, these sites with that have the word portals in there, those were actually created when my tenant was created. This Compliance Policy Center as well was created for me as part of my tenant. This site collection that has -my, that's actually storage for what used to be called My Sites, but now it's really Delve, where your profile pages are stored that show information about particular users. These site collections such as news, projects, records, BI Center, these are site collections that I have manually created. If we go to our team site here, and if you notice, the URL is mytenantname.sharepoint.com. Site page is the name of my library, and home is the document within my library, which happens to be a web page that's home.aspx. If I click on my site contents link here, if you notice, this has a different look and feel, and that's because Microsoft has rolled out this concept of modern lists and libraries, and this is the quote-unquote modern site contents page, which looks a little different than the way SharePoint sites looked in the past. If you look here, I can see all the different libraries and lists that are a part of my site here, my top-level site. And if I click on subsites here, I can actually see all the particular sites that are included inside this top-level site. I could do the same thing. I could click down to these various locations. If I click on marketing and I go to its site contents page, in turn I could see which lists and libraries are a part of this and if it also had any subsites that were a part of it. So when we talk about lists or libraries, what is a list or library? Well, we have different notions and different software of something as basic as something with lists, rows and columns. So if you worked with an Excel workbook, you'd have rows and columns, or an Access table, same idea, or a table in a database such as SQL or Oracle. So really, SharePoint List is no different. You basically are going to set up columns, and each column can contain multiple rows, and that's what a list is. So what makes a list a list? In a list, each column of data really describes the overall item. For example, a calendar is a kind of list. I have a company picnic, but really just having a title company picnic is not helpful if I don't have a location, and a start time, and possibly an end time. All of these pieces of information in its totality really describe the information being stored. Leaving out a lot of these pieces of information means you're not really going to be left with anything very useful. A list item, a particular item in a list can have files associated with it, but they are really considered attachments. So for instance, if I have an issues log, people could associate one or more files with that list item, but they might be screenshots describing the issue that's being logged. The file is not what's predominant within the list item. It's really the information in the list item, and the file is supporting it. A library is a kind of list, but it necessarily has to have a file associated with it. And in general, the columns associated with that library are describing the item in the file. So for example, if I have a document and that has a column called project ID, that's because this document itself is associated with that project ID. Or if it has a project manager or other pieces of information, if it's a contract, it might be the date the contract was signed or who the contract was signed with. So really the information stored in those columns are really describing the information stored fundamentally in that file. Now, libraries do have the ability for check-in, check-out, which is nice if you want to make sure that people are not co-authoring at the same time. However, using Office 365, you do have the benefits of co-authoring, which means that more than one person can work on a document at the same time. And you'll actually see little messages pop up that say, this other person is working on this, and you'll get little bubbles and little information, and you'll actually be able to see them type at the same time that you're typing, which is pretty neat. Additionally, libraries can handle both major and minor versions, as I mentioned at the beginning of this deck, which is incredibly helpful in terms of keeping your implementation clean and not having a bunch of files with the same name and users having to figure out which version is the real version. Along those lines, when files are being shared, if you use your Outlook client, at least the Windows Outlook client, I'm not sure if Mac is caught up yet, but if you attach a file to Outlook, you actually can attach it right from OneDrive or SharePoint, which means you're not emailing around various copies of the document, but you're actually can email a reference to the document in its original location, which means everybody's accessing the same version of the document and you're not having to keep track of which version was emailing around. Each list or library can have something called a view, and that's just a configured way of being able to see the information that's stored in the list or view. So when you create a view, you can determine which columns are being displayed. You can group, sort, and filter the information stored within that list or library. You can limit the number of items returned, and for some list or libraries, there's going to be a custom presentation. For example, if you're looking at a calendar, you can have the actual month view, or week view, or day view. And this is a little different than just the typical out-of-the-box view for a list. A content type, like columns, is defined in a site, usually at the top-level site. It can also be defined in a library. Actually, no, it can only be defined in the site. It used to be you could find in a library, but not anymore. For a content type, you are going to actually apply the content type to a list or library. What is a content type to? The content type fundamentally is a way to reuse a definition in more than one location. What this means is if you have a kind of document, a kind of list item, and you want it to be applied in more than one list or library, you're going to create a content type for it. A content type is going to have a name. And that seems really obvious, but that's the most basic information about the content type. For example, I'm not going to create a content type called date, but that content type is of type document. A document would not be classified as a birthday, perhaps. So really the name is the most obvious piece of information that indicates to the user what kind of information is this. It could be a called report or expense report or picture or meeting photo or something like that. A content type is also going to have site columns associated with it. So if I had a content type called project document, I might have a column associated with it called project ID. I also can associate a template with it. So if someone goes to a library and they say, I want to create a new project budget, it might automatically pull up an Excel spreadsheet that has a template already associated with it. So users, all they have to do is fill it out. And it might also have already a piece of metadata or a column associated with that content type. So that someone creates a project budget, they're required to associate a project with it, a project ID. That way, every single project is always associated with a project number. Content types can also have something called an information management policy, which is typically a retention policy. Retention policies are incredibly helpful for legal reasons if you want to make sure that any document or item within your library is going to get some action is going to happen to it. And oftentimes that means simply sending it to the recycle bin, or you can do things such as send an email to a user to say, would you want to do something with this? A retention policy can be custom built, but when you're thinking about how you structure the content in your site, if everything is classified simply using the document content type, which is the content type that comes out of the box with the document library, they're never going to go away ever unless you set a retention policy for all documents. So if you want to make sure that certain kind of documents are necessarily kept for a longer period of time or kept for a shorter period of time and are being sent to the recycle bin, making sure you classify content using a content type means it's going to necessarily have this retention type or retention policy associated with it. It's also possible to associate workflows with a content type. And every content type has a parent content type. This is important because, as I mentioned before, if you are trying to create something that's an event that belongs in a calendar, you can't create it with a parent content type of document. Really, there are certain base content types, such as pictures, documents, list items, events. There are a number of these sort of basic content type, and when you create a new content type, you're going to inherit from one of those. But you can actually have your content types inherit from your content types. So you can actually create these whole hierarchies which have different rules associated with them. So why use content types? Like I say, a content type is a way to reuse your definition across a site or a site collection. For instance, if I have a content type called expense report, and I want to make sure that each department has their own subsite, and each department subsite is going to have a library called expense reports. If that happens, what I can do is I can create one content type in my top level site, and then I can associate that content type with each expense reports library in each of my particular subsites. And that way I know that every time, regardless of which subsite that expense report is being added to, it's always going to have the same columns, the same retention policy, etc. Now, that being said, content types are copied to lists and libraries, and in fact, within that list or library, users can tweak that content type, how it's used at that particular level. Although you as the site collection administrator can go back and overwrite those changes that have been made at the local level. The benefit of using content types is that lists and libraries can contain more than one content type. So I'll show this to you in this demo how this works. So if I go back to my SharePoint site here, if I look at, I'm in my marketing site. Let me go back to my top level site here. All right. So here I've got a list called projects. Again, I'm going to switch over to this modern view here. This is a list in the sense that my list of projects really have no file associated with it. This is a straight up list, which means all I've done is I've created various columns associated with the list. In the modern view of the list, you simply need to click the plus sign, and it gives you the option right off the bat to create different columns of information right away. So I've got a project start date. Perhaps I want to add a project end date. I can do it right here. It's just that simple. It just adds it right away. If I want to modify an item in this modern view, I'm going to select the item and I'm going to click the info button, and here I'm going to see properties, and these are actually the column information. And if I want to edit that information, I can put my project end date right here and edit it just that easily. So this modern view creates a very easy way of editing this column information related to your list item. So this is a list. Now, if we look at different kinds of lists, I've got a library here called expense reports. Now, this is a document library in the sense that it's containing documents, not just list items. There is necessarily an Excel workbook associated with this document library. As I mentioned before, in this case, if I have something such as a week ending, this week ending is describing the document. This is an expense report for the week ending September 30th. So the information I'm collecting about the document is really related to the information stored within the document. If you do this in the modern list view, if you preview that item, you're actually going to get a preview of the document right there within that pane. And again, I can see information related to that expense report. I talked about views before. It is possible to create different views. In this case, my all documents view is simply going to show all the expense reports. You notice I've got some for different employees, different week ending dates. So what I've done is I've gone ahead and I've created several views. I've got one that's grouped by users, in which case I can see those expense reports that were submitted by me versus submitted by John Doe. And I also can go here and I can see my view called grouped by month. In this case, I can see all my expenses for the year, expense reports, and I can see them grouped by month regardless of who has submitted them. So what's great about a view here is it actually creates a way of being able to categorize and group information, which especially becomes helpful once you start to have large amounts of information within your lists or libraries. In this case, if I wanted to create a new item, if I create the new document, I have uploaded a custom expense report template. So if a user were to go to this library and say, I want to create a new document, in fact, what they're doing is they're going to create a new expense report within that library. So you can see here it's actually using my expense report form, which I, as a site administrator, have uploaded previously and associated to that library. I'm going to go back now to my project documents library. In this case, this is an example of a library where I'm not storing just one kind of information, but in this case, I've decided to store various kinds of information within the same library. So sometimes when you're trying to decide how you structure the content in your site, you want to structure it according to everything of one kind of thing is going to go into a single library. And that may happen if you just have a large volume of information and that's sufficient. And other times, you may want to store lots of different kinds of information within a single library, but rely on things like views and content types to be able to get to that information that you want to access. In this case, my All Documents view is just showing a PowerPoint, a budget, and a scope document, but I have been able to create what's called a lookup column. This lookup column is actually referencing my projects list. So every time a new item is added to my document library, I can associate it with a project. And we have what are called sympathetic columns here. It means that it's not only grabbing that project number, but it's actually bringing over things like the project title and the information about that project manager associated with that document. Because I have multiple content types associated with this library, I actually can go in and a user can decide what information they're going to be creating when they add that item to the library. So again, using things like content types and associated document templates, it means that if I create a new project scope document, again, it's going to use an actual template that I have uploaded ahead of time. So that when someone creates a new project scope document, that template is already populated. Now, if we look at things like retention policies, if I go to my expense reports library, I can select an item in that library, and if I go to the ellipsis here, if I do the ellipsis here, and I look at compliance details, I have created a retention policy that has been associated with this library. And it means that everything within this library is going to be sent to the recycle bin 1 year after the week ending date. So you can see that this item is going to be deleted at this particular date. And it'll give the date based on those rules because my week ending date was set to 9/29. Or that's, I guess, 9/30/2016. You can set up retention policies based on content types or libraries. So again, when you think about how you want to create your libraries and whether you want to have multiple items in a library with different content types or you want to have one library with one type of thing in there, you want to be able to think about things such as retention. Do I want everything to have the same retention policy, in which case having everything in one library might be helpful. You might say, I want everything in this library to be deleted after 3 years, regardless of content type. Or you can say, I want project scope documents to remain 3 years, but project budgets remain 1. You have that freedom based on setting these things at the library level or the content type level. All right, let's move on. Security in SharePoint. Just about like everything, many items, just as like on a file system, security is the nexus of 3 things. You have the item being secured, you have the permissions for that item, and you have the person. So if I was dealing with a folder on my hard drive, I could say my folder called projects has been granted read-only access to all authenticated users. In SharePoint, it's the same type of thing. But the security, the kind of things that can be secured in SharePoint are you can secure a site, the list or library within that site, a folder within a library, and an item within a list, or the list item or the document within that library. Security is trickle down. You see that site collection is not listed, and that's because if you set security at the top level site, it's going to be inherited by all your sites within that top level site. Lists and libraries inherit their settings from its parent site. A folder or a list item or a document is going to inherit its setting from its parent list or library. So for example, I could have a team site and I could grant edit permission to the SharePoint group called team site members. I could just as easily grant read permission to those team site members. So if you look at here, again, the SharePoint group team site members has edit permission to the team site and any inherited objects inside that site. Security or permissions in SharePoint are additive. What this means is I can't go in and say, I am revoking access to Becky Bertram. She is not allowed access to this site. In fact, all I can do is go and edit the security of whichever kind of thing I'm editing, a site, a list, a library, folder, etc., and just remove any permissions that a particular person has. So it means that if I don't have any permission granted to me, de facto I have no permissions. I can also have multiple permissions. What this means is I may be a member of the team site members group, which has edit permissions, and I might be a member of the team site owners group as well, which has full control. In which case I have both contribute and full control permissions on the site. User is always going to be granted the greater of the two. So if I've been granted more than one set of permissions, I'm always going to have the highest level of permissions that have been granted to me. And if you go to the security settings for a page, you can always type in a user's name, or security for an object, whether it's a site, a library, etc. I can go in and actually see what permissions a particular user has. You're also going to sometimes see a permission level called limited access, and that's just because if somebody has been granted access to view a document deep within your site, they have to be granted this limited access to all the parent levels, the parent library, the parent sites, etc., just so they can get access to that item deep down. Now, if they were to navigate to any of those items, they would get access denied, but if you see that limited access, that doesn't actually give someone access. That's just sort of a breadcrumb to get to the item that they actually have been granted permissions to. So let's look at a security demo here. So if I go to my top level site here, and I go to my site settings page, and I click on site permissions, I'm going to see here that some content on the site has different permissions from what you see here. So this actually lets me know that some permissions have been manually edited. If I click on this, it says, hey, my document library has special permissions. If I click on View Exceptions, this is actually going to take me where I can see in my document library this document has unique permissions. So it's nice within whatever you're looking at, you have a nice way of seeing what those unique permissions are. Now if I were to go to my document library, and if I went to my library settings and clicked on permissions for this document library, I can see here that it says this library inherits permissions from his parent. If I stopped inheriting permissions, that's what we call breaking inheritance. If I stopped inheriting permissions, I could go in and say, you know what, I want team site members to have full control. I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to say, you know what, in general, team site members have edit access, but in this case, I'm going to edit the user permission, and I'm going to say that team site members actually have full control of this library. So in this case, I have now created unique permissions for this document library. Along those lines, if I go to my library and I look at my individual document, if I click on the ellipsis and say Share, and if I click on Shared With, I'm going to see not only who has permissions to this item. If I click on the Advanced button, I'm actually getting to the same screen here. Notice in this case, I don't see team site members listed. Because team site members group isn't listed, they actually do not have permissions. So if I click on Check Permission, and I check my team site members, I'm actually going to see that they have no permissions to view this individual document because the permissions have not been granted to the team site members. All right, the last thing I want to talk about is search and surfacing data. SharePoint has the ability to create custom search results pages, which means that not only am I searching by the contents of a file, but I can actually search by that column information or that metadata. And in fact, I can do what's called refining results. I can create a custom search result page that says only search documents which have the content type of project scope, project budget, and I don't remember what my other one was, project document. So you can create certain search scopes which allow users to only search for certain content within your site. And you can also create certain refiners, which means I want users to be able to hone in. If they do a search for the word Acme, not only are they getting documents related to Acme, but they can actually refine their search results by project numbers and say, I only want to see Acme documents that were related to project ID 1000 or whatever. You can also use custom rendering for displaying search results, which means if I have a product catalog and in my SharePoint site I'm storing lots of information related to maybe toys that I'm selling or products, furniture, you can actually have a search results page which actually displays a picture that's stored within your SharePoint site and not just straight up text search results. This is part of a larger conversation in the sense that we have things like Delve, and if you go to the people page, you're actually going to see information of people that work close to you. Microsoft is doing a lot of legwork to be able to surface information that's relevant to people, and a lot of times this is based on who has worked on documents with a person. So for instance, if I check out a document and you check out the same document and we both edit the same document, Microsoft is going to figure out that we're probably colleagues and we probably work together because we've worked on the same information. Or if you go to the people page and Office 365 has figured out that you contact or send emails to a lot of the same people, I could be in a company that has 10,000 people in it, but if I really only work with 5 people on a regular basis, Office 365 can surface that information for me. So this again is where you get into the concept of data mining and social behavior that within a SharePoint site, using this whole model I've talked with you in terms of compliance and details and categorization and custom search results, that's where information is sort of top down. You're creating a highly managed, highly structured way of storing information within your site. However, Microsoft is also at the same time having this approach where information, no matter where it's stored, whether it's stored in OneDrive, or SharePoint, or even you emailed it as an attachment, any way that that information has been worked with within Office 365 can be surfaced using the Office Graph, which is a fancy word for the programming interface that sees information all across Office 365. As I mentioned before, you can't really have one without the other. At the beginning of this talk, I still am a firm believer that it's important for people to know, where am I storing documents? I want to talk a little bit about OneDrive versus SharePoint. OneDrive makes it incredibly easy to store information that you want to use. In other words, if I go to Exchange and I say I want to send a new email, it's going to give me the option really quick to save that attachment to OneDrive. However, OneDrive is really only accessible to you. In OneDrive, you can choose to share information, but it's really up to you to decide who has access to that. And unfortunately, when we have that scenario where perhaps someone leaves the organization, that information now has to be taken over by an administrator and transferred to somebody else. If you build your SharePoint information architecture in a helpful way, it means that everybody's going to have access to it, versus OneDrive, where you have access to it and only the people with whom you've shared it. And if they wanted to work on that document with you, how do they know where to find it? Again, Microsoft has created these interfaces like Delve, which are supposed to help you find those unfindable documents, but I personally still think it's a good idea to set up your SharePoint site in such a way that you're thinking about, is this something that everybody should have access to it, or is it really a kind of working document? So to sum up, when we think about how you're constructing your site, you're going to want to think about what a logical grouping of information is. Like I showed in this example, you may have a different site for different departments. You may choose to put them in different site collections. It's up to you in terms of a logical structure of information. In terms of who should have access to the information, security is a huge thing. How you structure your sites, your subsites, and your libraries may be dependent on who should have access to those, to that information. You also want to think about the kind of information that's being stored in a list or library. For example, like I had in my demo, am I going to store all my expense reports in a single library, or am I going to create a kind of library that can contain multiple kinds of information? And then do I have things like retention policies? Do I want to declare certain items a record? I haven't even talked about records management yet, but it's possible to have an entire records management solution in SharePoint. Do I want to have templates related to content types? So like in my demo, I can say I want to create a new project scope document, and everybody's creating that same kind of document. There are a number of times where SharePoint makes it very easy just to spin up a site, have a document library. It's completely unstructured, and you're going to completely rely on Delve to be able to surface the kind of information for you, or using the SharePoint page within Office 365. I haven't even mentioned that there's an app on your phone for SharePoint that surfaces sites for you as well. So again, Microsoft is sort of pushing this unmanaged approach because it's easier for end users, and there's a lot to be said for spinning up information quickly and easily. However, over time, it can be difficult to manage that. And in my personal opinion, I think that still putting some of these information management structures in place can help you manage content as it grows over time. As I said, I've covered a lot of content in this one lecture, so if you are interested in learning more, please feel free to dive into the course, and hopefully you can see a lot more detailed information how to work with each of these areas, complete with demos and hands-on labs. So that's it for me. Are any of you, again, if any of you have questions, please feel free to type it in the questions window here. Or to chat it to me, and I should be able to see it, and I can talk about it right now. So if you have questions, now is your time. I'll give you a few minutes to type them in, and then I can address them as I see them. All right. Well, if there are no questions for anyone, from anyone, then this again has been Becky Bertram. I have also created a slide deck for SharePoint Online administration. So if you want to have more detailed administration information, you can also go there. Thank you again for joining me today, and I will turn it back over to Ashley now.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, Becky, for just such an informative webinar. This will be available. We are going to be posting it to our Opsgility YouTube channel, and we can make this available to the attendees who have attended today. Basically, just to sum up everything, we do have a bunch of different types of training that we can offer. If you're interested, please let us know. You can contact info@opsgility.com, and we can actually get you some information on that class that Becky teaches if you wanted to go more in depth. And we have a promo code for if you wanted to try for 30 days on our online training. It's all capital letters, try Opsgility, all one word, all capital letters, try Opsgility. So you can enter in that promo code. You can get 30 days of free online on-demand training and kind of browse some of the other trainings that we offer. But then we also can do instructor-led live and virtual courses that can go even more in depth or have more of a one-on-one instructor feel. So please let us know if you're interested. Thank you again so much for attending, and you guys have a great rest of the afternoon.